The autumn morning air was crisped around Windsor Castle, as tourists began gathering for the daily changing of the guard ceremony. Los Angeles, who had traveled to England specifically to create viral content for his YouTube channel, with over 2 million subscribers hungry for his next outrageous stunt, Jake felt constant pressure to push boundaries and create. Built his online empire by filming himself in situations that most people would consider inappropriate or disrespectful. His channel, Jake's Wild Adventures, featured videos of him disrupting public events, bothering strangers in restaurants, and performing elaborate pranks that often crossed the line from harmless fun into genuine harassment. His teenage audience loved his rebellious attitude and willingness to do things they would never dare attempt themselves. Standing at attention near the castle's main entrance was Guardsman Michael Thompson, a 28-year-old member of the Coldstream Guards who had served 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan before earning his position in the prestigious Household Division. Michael took immense pride in his role protecting the royal family and maintaining the centuries-old traditions that made the British monarchy one of the world's most respected institutions. His red tunic was immaculate, his bearskin hat perfectly positioned, his rifle held with the precision that came from years of military training. Michael had joined the army at 18, driven by a deep sense of duty and respect for his country's values. His father had been a career soldier, and his grandfather had served during World War II, creating a family tradition of military service that stretched back generations. The opportunity to serve as a Queen's Guard represented the pinnacle of his military career, a position that required not only exceptional discipline and physical fitness, but also the mental strength to maintain perfect composure under any circumstances. Jake pulled out his professional camera equipment, including multiple high-definition cameras, wireless microphones, and a drone for aerial footage. His plan was simple but potentially lucrative: create a video showing himself getting increasingly close to the guards, testing their legendary discipline while providing entertaining commentary for his audience. He had researched the guards' reputation for remaining motionless and silent regardless of provocation, and he saw this as the perfect revenue. The morning crowd included families with young children, elderly tourists from around the world, and photography enthusiasts hoping to capture the pageantry of the ceremony. Most visitors maintained a respectful distance from the guards, understanding that these were active duty soldiers performing their duties rather than tourist attractions or entertainment performers. Parents quietly explained to their children about the importance of the guards' role and the need to show proper respect for their service. Jake began filming his introduction while walking toward the castle, his voice loud and energetic as he addressed his camera. "What's up, Jake's Wild Adventures family? Today we're at Windsor Castle in England, and I'm about to test the limits of these famous British guards everyone talks about." His casual disrespect for the solemnity of the location immediately caught the attention of other visitors, many of whom began moving away from him with expressions of disapproval and embarrassment. A British family with 2 young children looked particularly uncomfortable as Jake's loud American accent cut through the respectful atmosphere that normally surrounded his rigid posture and focused gaze as his training demanded. He had encountered countless tourists during his time as a guard, and most were respectful visitors genuinely interested in British history and tradition. However, his experienced eye quickly identified Jake as a potential problem. Recognizing the aggressive body language and attention-seeking behavior that often preceded incidents requiring intervention, Jake set up his primary camera on a tripod, about 20 feet from Michael's position, then activated his wireless microphone and began his performance. "All right, everyone, here's the plan. I'm going to get closer and closer to this guard and see how he reacts. These guys are supposed to be like robots, completely emotionless, no matter what happens. I bet I can get a reaction if I try hard enough." The crowd around Jake began too thin as his intentions became clear. Several elderly visitors shook their heads in disgust and moved to different viewing positions. Spectacle. A few teenage tourists remained nearby, apparently entertained by Jake's bold approach and curious to see how far he would push the boundaries. Michael's training included extensive instruction on dealing with disruptive visitors while maintaining the dignity of his position and the institution he represented. Guards were taught to remain motionless and silent except in cases of genuine security threats, but they were also trained to recognize when situations might escalate beyond mere tourist curiosity into actual harassment or danger. Jake began his approach slowly, walking in a wide circle around Michael, while providing running commentary for his camera. "Look at this guy. He's like a statue. I bet he's been standing there for hours without moving. Let's see what happens when I get a little closer." Tourists observed, but not yet close enough to trigger any official response. The morning sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the castle courtyard as Jake continued his performance, unaware that his actions were being observed not only by his cameras and the surrounding tourists, but also by castle security personnel. Jake's confidence grew as he interpreted Michael's disciplined silence as weakness rather than professional restraint. Moving closer to the guard, Jake began making exaggerated facial expressions directly in front of Michael's face, waving his hands dramatically while maintaining a constant stream of commentary. It's designed to provoke a reaction that would make compelling content for his millions of subscribers. "This is incredible, guys," Jake announced to his camera, his voice growing louder and more theatrical with each passing minute. "This dude is completely ignoring me. It's like he's not even human. Watch this." Began jumping up and down, inches from Michael's position, deliberately trying to startle the guard or break his concentration through sudden movements and loud noises. The remaining tourists watched with a mixture of fascination and horror as Jake's behavior became increasingly aggressive and disrespectful. A group of German visitors whispered among themselves in obvious disapproval, while an elderly British couple looked genuinely offended by the young American's treatment of their country's military traditions. Several people began filming Jake's performance with their own phones, though their intent seemed to be documentation of inappropriate behavior rather than entertainment. Michael's military training served him well, as he maintained his position despite Jake's escalating provocations. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, his breathing stayed controlled and even, and his grip on his rifle never wavered. Despite the growing urge to respond to the disrespectful behavior occurring just inches from his face, years of discipline in combat zones had taught him to compartmentalize distractions and focus on his primary mission regardless of external circumstances. Jake interpreted Michael's continued silence as permission to escalate his tactics further. He began making loud comments about the guard's appearance, mocking his uniform and questioning his masculinity in terms that would have resulted in immediate confrontation in any civilian context. "Look at this outfit. Out. What grown man dresses up like this? I bet this guy has never been in a real fight in his life." The insults struck particularly deep because Michael had indeed been in real fights. Life-and-death combat situations in Afghanistan where his courage and leadership had saved the lives of fellow soldiers. He carried shrapnel scars from an IED explosion that had killed 2 of his closest friends, and he wore his current uniform as a tribute to their memory and his commitment to continued service. Jake's casual mockery of his military service triggered emotions that required tremendous self-control to suppress. Castle security personnel had been monitoring the situation through surveillance cameras and were beginning to position themselves for potential intervention. However, their protocols required allowing the guards themselves to handle tourist interactions unless actual physical assault occurred or security threats were identified. They watched with professional concern as Jake's behavior continued to escalate beyond normal tourist enthusiasm into what appeared to be deliberate harassment. Jake's audience engagement was his primary concern. He could see from his camera's viewfinder that his subscriber count was climbing rapidly as word spread through social media about his live confrontation with the British Guard. Comments and reactions were flooding in from viewers around the world, with many encouraging him to push even further for their entertainment. The potential for viral fame and substantial financial rewards drove him to ignore the obvious discomfort of everyone around him. "I know what will get a reaction," Jake announced to his camera with the confident grin that had made him famous among his teenage followers. He began making crude gestures and inappropriate comments about the royal family, deliberately choosing the most offensive language possible in an attempt to provoke Michael into breaking character and providing the dramatic climax his video needed to achieve maximum viral potential. Michael's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, as Jake's comments became increasingly personal and disrespectful toward the institution he had sworn to protect. The royal family represented not just his employers, but the constitutional foundation of his country's government and the living symbol of British values and traditions. Allowing such disrespect to continue unchallenged went against every instinct he had developed during his years of military service. The crowd around them had grown larger as word spread through the castle grounds about the confrontation taking place. However, instead of the supportive audience Jake had hoped for, most of the new arrivals looked disgusted by his behavior and sympathetic toward the guard was maintaining such impressive discipline under increasingly difficult circumstances. Several British visitors began making comments among themselves about typical American behavior and the need for someone to intervene before the situation escalated further. Jake's cameraman, who had been hired specifically for this trip, began showing signs of discomfort with the direction the video was taking. He had worked with Jake on previous projects, but this level of disrespect toward military personnel in a foreign country made him nervous about potential legal consequences and damage to his own professional reputation. He continued filming but began positioning himself for a quick exit if the situation deteriorated into actual conflict. Michael's training included specific protocols for dealing with increasingly aggressive tourists, but Jake's behavior was pushing well beyond the normal boundaries that even the most disruptive visitors typically observed. The combination of personal insults, mockery of military service, and disrespect toward the royal family was creating a perfect storm of provocations that would challenge even the most disciplined soldier's ability to maintain composure. Jake sensed that he was approaching some kind of breaking point and decided to escalate his tactics one final time to achieve the dramatic confrontation that would guarantee his video's viral success. He had no understanding of the military discipline he was challenging or the personal cost that Michael was paying to maintain his professional composure in the face of such deliberate disrespect and provocation. Michael's internal struggle intensified as Jake's provocations reached levels that would have been unthinkable in any other context. The young influencer seemed completely oblivious to the fact that he was systematically attacking everything the guard held sacred: his military service, his personal honor, his country's traditions, and the institution he had sworn to protect. Years of combat experience had taught Michael to recognize genuine threats. But Jake represented something different, and perhaps more insidious: the weaponization of disrespect for personal gain. Jake's behavior had attracted the attention of castle security supervisors, who were now conducting urgent consultations about intervention protocols. The situation had evolved far beyond typical tourist enthusiasm or even standard disruptive behavior into what appeared to be systematic harassment of military personnel. However, their procedures required careful consideration of international diplomatic implications, given that Jake was an American citizen filming what he clearly intended to present as representative British behavior. The crowd dynamics had shifted dramatically as word spread throughout the castle grounds about the confrontation. Instead of the supportive audience Jake had expected, he found himself surrounded by increasingly hostile observers who viewed his behavior as an attack on their national dignity and military traditions. British visitors looked particularly offended, while international tourists seemed embarrassed to be witnessing such disrespectful behavior from a fellow foreigner. Michael's military background included extensive training in de-escalation techniques and conflict resolution, skills that had served him well during his deployment in Afghanistan, where cultural sensitivity and appropriate responses to provocation could mean the difference between successful missions and international incidents. However, Jake's behavior seemed specifically designed to exploit the constraints of his ceremonial position and push beyond the boundaries of normal human tolerance. Jake's social media metrics were climbing rapidly as his live stream attracted viewers from around the world, many of whom were sharing and commenting on the spectacle in real time. His subscriber count was increasing by thousands every minute, when the potential advertising revenue from such a viral video could fund months of future content creation. These financial incentives drove him to ignore the obvious signals that his behavior was crossing lines that should never be crossed. "This guy is like a robot,"
Oh.
Jake announced loudly to his camera, his voice echoing off the ancient stone walls of the castle. "I've been trying everything to get a reaction, and he just stands there like nothing's happening. But I've got one more trick that's guaranteed to work." He pulled out his phone and began playing loud,
Oh, maybe crazy.
inappropriate music directly next to Michael's ear, while dancing around him in deliberately ridiculous movements designed to humiliate both himself and the guard. The music was not just loud, but specifically chosen to be as offensive and inappropriate as possible for the dignified setting of Windsor Castle. The lyrics contained explicit language and themes that were completely unsuitable for the family-friendly environment, where children and elderly visitors were trying to enjoy a cultural experience. Parents began covering their children's ears and moving them away from Jake's performance area. Michael's breathing became slightly more controlled as he employed meditation, techniques learned during his military training to maintain focus despite the cacophony of noise and movement surrounding him. His peripheral vision registered the growing crowd of disapproving observers. He could sense the tension building among both tourists and security personnel, who were clearly approaching the limits of their patience with Jake's behavior. Castle security had positioned additional personnel at strategic points around the confrontation area, prepared to intervene if Jake's behavior escalated to actual physical contact or if the situation began threatening the safety of other visitors. Their radio communications included updates to senior castle administrators and coordination with local police authorities who might need to become involved if diplomatic considerations required formal intervention. Jake's cameraman had begun backing away from the immediate area, his professional instincts warning him that the situation was approaching a point where continued filming might become legally problematic. He had worked on enough controversial projects to recognize when content creation was transforming into potential criminal activity, and Jake's increasingly aggressive behavior was raising red flags about possible charges of harassment or public disturbance. The music blaring from Jake's phone was now attracting attention from throughout the castle grounds, with visitors from hundreds of yards away beginning to investigate the source of the disturbance. The contrast between the sacred, respectful atmosphere that normally surrounded royal residences and the crude spectacle Jake was creating highlighted just how far his behavior had departed from acceptable social norms. Michael's military training included specific instructions about maintaining dignity under provocation, but it also included guidelines about recognizing when situations required decisive action to protect institutional integrity and personal safety. Jake's behavior was pushing rapidly toward thresholds that might justify breaking from ceremonial protocols in favor of active intervention to restore order and appropriate respect. The morning sun continued climbing higher, casting harsh shadows across the confrontation area as Jake prepared what he announced would be his final attempt to provoke a reaction from the disciplined guard. His confidence remained high despite the increasingly hostile crowd surrounding him, and he seemed genuinely convinced that his next escalation would finally break through Michael's professional composure and provide the dramatic climax's video needed to achieve maximum viral impact. Jake had no understanding that Michael's silence was not weakness, but rather the disciplined restraint of a combat veteran who understood the difference between appropriate response and unnecessary escalation. The guard's apparent passivity masked years of training in when and how to apply force effectively, and Jake was about to discover that some boundaries should never be crossed regardless of the potential for social media fame. Jake's final escalation crossed a line that he couldn't have understood without military experience or genuine respect for the institutions he was mocking. He reached out and actually touched Michael's rifle, wrapping his fingers around the barrel, while grinning at his camera and making jokes about playing soldier with toy weapons that he assumed were purely ceremonial props rather than functional military equipment. The moment Jake's hand made contact with Michael's weapon, everything changed. The rifle was not a prop, but a fully functional military firearm, and touching a guard's weapon constituted a serious security breach that triggered immediate response protocols, regardless of the perpetrator's apparent intentions or nationality. Michael's training took over instantly, transforming him from a ceremonial statue into an active-duty soldier responding to a potential threat. "Stand back." Michael's voice exploded across the courtyard with the commanding authority of a combat veteran, accustomed to life-and-life situations where hesitation could be fatal. The sudden transformation from silent statue to vocal warrior shocked everyone within hearing distance, including Jake, who stumbled backward. With genuine surprise and fear replacing his earlier confidence, the crowd's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Children began crying at the sudden shouting. Parents grabbed their families and moved quickly away from the confrontation area. And even Jake's cameraman dropped his equipment in startled response to the guard's explosive command. The respectful, tourist-friendly atmosphere of the morning was instantly replaced by the tense reality of military security protocols being activated. Michael maintained his grip on his rifle while positioning himself in a defensive stance that clearly communicated his readiness to escalate further if Jake continued his inappropriate behavior. His years of combat experience had taught him to assess threats quickly and respond with precisely the level of force necessary to neutralize danger while avoiding unnecessary escalation. Jake's touch of his weapon had crossed from harassment into potential security threat territory. Jake's social media bravado evaporated instantly as he found himself face-to-face with the reality of what he had been mocking, the toy soldier. In the funny costume had revealed himself to be a highly trained military professional capable of decisive action when circumstances warranted. Jake's hands shook as he held up his phone, still recording but now clearly terrified by the situation he had created. I was just making a video," Jake stammered, his voice lacking any of the confident swagger that had characterized his earlier performance. The reality of potentially serious legal and diplomatic consequences began penetrating his social media bubble as he realized that his actions might have implications far beyond YouTube views and subscriber counts. Castle security personnel immediately converged on the area, their radios crackling with rapid communications as they coordinated response procedures for what had officially become a security incident rather than a simple tourist disruption. Senior officers were already en route. Protocols were being activated that could result in Jake's detention and potential prosecution under British law. Michael maintained his alert posture while keeping his eyes fixed on Jake, his military training automatically cataloging potential escape routes, additional threats, and response options based on how the situation continued to develop. His earlier restraint had not been weakness, but rather the disciplined patience of a professional warrior who understood when and how to apply force appropriately. The transformation in crowd dynamics was remarkable, where Jake had earlier been surrounded by disapproving but passive observers, he now found himself at the center of what had become an active security situation with armed military personnel and professional security officers taking control of the area. The casual atmosphere of tourist entertainment had been replaced by the serious business of protecting national security and institutional dignity. Jake's cameraman had completely abandoned his equipment and was attempting to distance himself from the situation, apparently hoping to avoid being associated with what had clearly become a serious incident with potential legal ramifications. The expensive filming equipment lay scattered on the ancient stones, forgotten in the face of more immediate concerns about personal safety and legal liability. Michael's command voice continued to dominate the area as he maintained control of the situation while security personnel established a perimeter and began clearing unnecessary observers from the immediate vicinity. His professional composure had returned, but now it was the controlled alertness of a soldier managing a security incident rather than the ceremonial stillness of a tourist attraction. "You will remain exactly where you are," Michael instructed. Jake, with the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question, "Security personnel will be with you momentarily to address your actions." His voice carried none of the entertainment value Jake had been seeking, only the serious consequences of pushing trained military professionals beyond the boundaries of their patience and protocols. The crowd of onlookers had grown even larger as news of the confrontation spread throughout the castle grounds, but the nature of their attention had shifted completely. Instead of watching tourist entertainment, They were now witnessing the serious business of security protocols being enforced against someone who had clearly crossed important lines of respect and appropriate behavior. Jake stood frozen in place, his phone still recording, but his earlier confidence completely shattered by the reality of facing genuine consequences for his actions. The viral video he had planned was certainly being created, but not in the way he had intended, and the fame he was about to achieve would likely be of a very different and much more problematic nature than what he had originally envisioned. Within minutes of Michael's command, Castle Security had established a complete perimeter around the incident area while senior officers arrived to assess the situation and determine appropriate response procedures. Jake found himself at the center of a highly coordinated security operation involving multiple levels of authority, from castle guards to local police to diplomatic liaisons who would need to manage the international implications of detaining an American citizen on royal property. Detective Inspector Sarah Williams arrived as the senior investigating officer. Her 20 years of experience in handling sensitive situations involving foreign nationals and high-profile locations immediately evident in how she took control of the scene. She had dealt with countless incidents at royal residences, but Jake's systematic escalation, from tourist disruption to weapons contact, represented a more serious category of offense that could result in significant legal consequences. Jake's phone continued recording throughout the detention process, though his earlier enthusiasm had been completely replaced by growing panic as the reality of his situation became clear. The viral video he had planned was indeed being created, but instead of showing him successfully provoking a British guard, it was documenting his arrest for behavior that violated multiple British laws regarding royal security and military personnel. Harassment. The crowd of observers had been moved back to a safe distance, but many continued filming the aftermath with their own devices, creating multiple angles of documentation that would soon spread across social media platforms worldwide. However, unlike Jake's intended content, these videos portrayed him not as a successful prankster, but as someone facing serious consequences for disrespectful and potentially criminal behavior. Michael had returned to his ceremonial position, but remained at elevated alert status as security procedures continued around him. His professional handling of the situation had earned obvious respect from his colleagues and the observing tourists, many of whom began approaching the security perimeter to express their support for his measured but decisive response to Jake's provocations. Detective Inspector Williams began her preliminary interview with Jake while Castle Security reviewed surveillance footage and witness statements from the dozens of tourists who had observed the entire confrontation. The evidence was overwhelming and clearly documented Jake's systematic escalation from casual disruption to actual physical contact with military equipment, creating an indisputable record of his violations. Mr. Morrison. Detective Inspector Williams began with the professional courtesy that British law enforcement extends even to individuals facing serious charges. You are being detained under the Public Order Act for behavior likely to cause harassment, alarm, and distress, and under the Official Secrets Act for unauthorized contact with military equipment on royal property. You have the right to legal representation and to contact the American Embassy. Jake's face went pale as the formal charges were explained to him, his earlier confidence in his legal immunity as an American tourist evaporating as he realized that his actions had serious consequences, regardless of his nationality or intentions. The potential penalties for his behavior included substantial fines, imprisonment, and permanent deportation from the United Kingdom. Outcomes that would devastate his social media career and personal life. The American Embassy's consular services had been notified of Jake's detention, beginning a diplomatic process that would involve formal documentation of his actions and coordination between British and American authorities regarding his case. His status as a social media influencer with millions of followers would likely increase rather than decrease the scrutiny his case would receive from both legal and diplomatic perspectives. Jake's abandoned filming equipment was collected as evidence, including his professional cameras, wireless microphones, and drone equipment that had been used to document his systematic harassment of military personnel. The high-quality footage he had been so proud of creating would now serve as primary evidence against him in legal proceedings that could result in substantial punishment. Michael's colleagues from the Coldstream Guards had arrived to provide support and witness statements about the incident. Their professional solidarity evident in their obvious pride in how he had handled an extremely difficult situation with appropriate restraint, followed by decisive action when necessary. His reputation within the regiment would be enhanced by his textbook response to provocation and security threat. The international media tension began almost immediately as news of Jake's arrest spread through social media channels and was picked up by mainstream news outlets on both sides of the Atlantic. However, the coverage was overwhelmingly negative toward Jake's behavior, with most reports focusing on his disrespectful treatment of British military traditions and his apparent ignorance of appropriate behavior while visiting foreign countries. Castle administrators conducted urgent reviews of security protocols and tourist management procedures to prevent similar incidents in the future, while also considering whether Jake's case warranted special measures to deter other social media influencers from attempting copycat provocations. The balance between maintaining public access to royal residences and protecting military personnel from harassment required constant adjustment based on evolving threats. Jake's social media accounts experienced immediate backlash as news of his arrest spread, with his subscriber count beginning to decline rapidly as viewers expressed disgust with his behavior and disappointment in his treatment of military personnel. The viral fame he had sought was indeed being achieved, but in the form of worldwide condemnation rather than the celebration he had anticipated. Detective Inspector Williams continued her investigation by interviewing witnesses and reviewing additional surveillance footage from throughout the castle grounds, building a comprehensive case that documented not only Jake's final act of touching Michael's weapon, but also his systematic campaign of harassment and disrespect that had led to that culminating violation. The evidence would support multiple charges and significant penalties that would serve as deterrent to others considering similar behavior. As evening approached, Jake remained in custody while legal proceedings continued their careful course. Through the British justice system, his dreams of viral fame having been replaced by the harsh reality of facing serious criminal charges in a foreign country, whose laws and customs he had deliberately chosen to violate for entertainment purposes. The legal proceedings that followed Jake's arrest moved through the British court system with the methodical thoroughness that characterizes serious criminal cases involving national security and military personnel. His case attracted significant media attention on both sides of the Atlantic. Though the coverage was overwhelmingly critical of his behavior and supportive of the measured response from Castle Security and the Guards Regiment, Jake's parents flew from Los Angeles to London when they learned of their son's arrest, their shock and embarrassment evident as they struggled to understand how their child's pursuit of social media fame had led to serious criminal charges in a foreign country. They hired expensive British legal counsel and began the difficult process of navigating international diplomatic channels, while dealing with the global humiliation of their son's behavior being broadcast worldwide. The American embassy provided standard consular services but made clear that Jake's actions fell well outside the bounds of behavior that warranted special diplomatic protection. His systematic harassment of military personnel and violation of security protocols at a royal residence created significant strain in diplomatic relations, and embassy officials were more focused on damage control than on protecting Jake. From the consequences of his actions, Detective Inspector Williams's investigation produced overwhelming evidence of Jake's violations, including high-definition footage from his own cameras that documented every aspect of his escalating harassment campaign. The irony that his own equipment provided the strongest evidence against him is not lost on legal observers who noted that social media culture's obsession with documentation had created a perfect record of criminal behavior. Michael Thompson returned to his regular duties with the Coldstream Guards, though his handling of the Jake Morrison incident had earned him significant recognition within military circles and among the British public. His demonstration of appropriate restraint followed by decisive action when necessary became a textbook example of professional military bearing under extreme provocation, and he received commendations from senior officers for his exemplary service. Trial proceedings revealed the full extent of Jake's planning and preparation for his confrontation with the guards, including evidence that he had researched their protocols specifically to identify ways to exploit their professional constraints for his entertainment purposes. This premeditation significantly aggravated the seriousness of his charges and the potential penalties he faced under British law. Jake's social media empire collapsed rapidly as his subscriber count plummeted and advertising partners terminated their contracts with him. The viral fame he had sought was achieved in the worst possible way, with millions of people around the world viewing his arrest footage and expressing disgust at his treatment of military personnel and disrespect for British institutions. His brand became permanently associated with arrogance, disrespect, and criminal behavior. The court case concluded with Jake pleading guilty to multiple charges including harassment of military personnel, breach of security protocols at a royal residence, and public disorder. The judge's sentencing included substantial fines, a period of imprisonment, and permanent banishment from all royal properties throughout the United Kingdom. The legal costs and diplomatic complications also resulted in his being banned from returning to the UK for a minimum of 10 years. Michael's testimony during the trial was delivered with the same professional dignity that had characterized his handling of the original incident. He explained his military background, his understanding of appropriate protocols, and his decision-making process when Jake's behavior escalated from harassment to security threat. His calm, factual presentation impressed court observers and further highlighted the contrast between professional military service and Jake's attention-seeking behavior. The international media coverage of Jake's conviction became a cautionary tale about the dangers of social media culture encouraging increasingly extreme behavior for views and engagement. Educational institutions began using his case as an example in courses about digital citizenship, cultural sensitivity, and the real-world consequences of online behavior that crosses legal and ethical boundaries. Jake served his prison sentence in a British facility where he had ample time to reflect on how his pursuit of viral fame had destroyed his career, damaged international relations, and brought shame to his family. His fellow inmates were largely unsympathetic to someone whose criminal behavior had been motivated purely by social media tension rather than any genuine hardship or necessity. Upon his release and deportation back to the United States, Jake attempted to rebuild his social media presence by creating content about his experiences in British prison and his reflections on the incident that had led to his downfall. However, his audience had largely moved on to other influencers, and his association with criminal behavior made him unmarketable to legitimate sponsors and collaborators. The lasting impact of the incident extended far beyond Jake's personal consequences. Castle security protocols were updated to provide clearer guidance about social media filming and tourist behavior,
While the guards' regiments received additional training on managing modern challenges, like viral content creation and online harassment,
that their predecessors could never have anticipated. Michael Thompson's career continued to flourish, with his professional handling of the Jake Morrison incident contributing to his promotion within the Coldstream Guards and his selection for additional high-profile ceremonial duties. His example became part of training programs for new guards, demonstrating how traditional military values of discipline, restraint, and decisive action when necessary remain relevant in the modern world of social media and instant global communication. Story became a powerful reminder that some institutions and values are too important to be sacrificed for entertainment, and that the pursuit of viral fame should never come at the expense of respect for others, particularly those who dedicate their lives to serving something greater than themselves. Jake's fall from social media stardom to criminal conviction served as a cautionary tale about the real-world consequences of online behavior that crosses the boundaries of decency and law.